So I'd like to welcome you to Provocation 5 and Beware the Siren Song of Gen AI feedback. And what I'd like Elise to do, if she could move through the next slide, please. Thank you. First of all, do our acknowledgement of country. We are today here on Dharawal land, but we acknowledge that Liz is coming to us from Melbourne, and we respect all the lands where people are joining us from today. Country is getting a bit of a drink, which it sorely needs because it's been very, very dry. So while the rain may hamper some things, country is very, very grateful for the water. We acknowledge the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus footprint and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So this is number 5 in our provocation series. This is week 3 of the provocations. So we have another 2 this week. If you haven't registered for our other provocation sections, the link is available there for you, and we can put the link in the chat as well. You do need to register separately for each provocation because they have their own unique link. Over to Elise.
Very good morning to you all, and very big thank you to Professor Elizabeth Molloy for joining us. I have the privilege of introducing Professor Elizabeth, who is a researcher in workplace learning, feedback and assessment in medical education and higher education. She's received a Karolinska Institute Fellowship in Medical Education Research and is part of a Lancet Commission investigating academic responsibility. Professor Molloy is also the Deputy Dean of Education in the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Elizabeth Molloy, who will walk us through what proves to be a very interesting provocation with, I have to say, my favourite title of all of them. Not that we're allowed to have favourites, but I'm very excited and grateful for your time with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elise, and thank you, Anne. It's a delight to talk with you today, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my deep respects to elders past and present, and to leaders who are coming through, and amazing leaders who are coming through our programs. We did get a good drink here on Wurundjeri land over the weekend, and I was marshal for my girls' soccer games, two games in a row. So I did come back very sodden, but I was also very appreciative of the big drink of our land. So yeah, and I would like firstly like to say, Anne, thank you for your time last week. It was great to meet with you and to discuss the Renaissance. And I suppose I'm really impressed that as an institution, you're taking this opportunity to not just think about compliance. We hear a lot about assured learning and secure assessment. And I think if we just take a compliance angle, that would be pretty pedestrian. And I suppose I'm really excited by universities that are celebrating this idea of what could we do differently? Where could we shake up our practices? And if we're really mindful of having students at the heart of everything we do, how could we better redesign assessment? So I'm coming with this provocation with that spirit in mind. So I'll share my slides. Okay, so so the Siren Song of Gen AI, and I'm going to put in a little subtitle here around when we think about cultivating learners' feedback know-how, or what other people might call feedback literacy, why should we also account for know-who in the age of Gen AI? So I want you to just keep that rattling around in the cortex as we talk through these ideas. All right, so we've acknowledged country. Just a little bit of background in terms of Elise shared my role here. at the University of Melbourne. I've got 3 weeks left in this role, and then I have a little break, and then starting as Pro-Vice Chancellor Curriculum for the University of Melbourne. So I will be crossing boundaries and borders and looking at assessment design and curriculum design across the different disciplines. So really welcoming that challenge and excited and terrified in the same breath. In terms of other acknowledgements, so I would like to acknowledge the chat that I had with Anne, very informative and exciting. I hope we can keep discussing, Anne, some of these ideas. And I'd also like to acknowledge the work of my colleagues, Thomas Corbin, Margaret Bierman, who work closely with David Bowd. I know he's been involved in the Renaissance. We met last year in Copenhagen, and we produced what is called the Feedback Manifesto. And as part of that discussion, we did have a debate about this idea of what we care about and sort of what we care about, what we're motivated by, and how this influences feedback processes in the age of Gen AI. And it kind of seeded some of the thoughts that I'd like to propose to you today. I've also been working closely with a team here at the university on what we call an intervention funded by a Learning and Teaching Initiative grant. And it is about using simulation to cultivate learners' feedback know-how. And I want to draw on some of those findings along with this kind of more conceptual work that we did in Copenhagen to come at this idea of the provocation. So the siren song of Gen AI precision data. So we all, I'm sure, know the story of Ulysses and the sirens, and this idea of hearing that seductive, glorious sound of the sirens, which is alluring, but we know how that ended up with the ship crashing up on the rocks. And I suppose one thing that I have been really, trying to push myself to understand is that we hear so much about the siren song of Gen AI feedback in the form of data that, it is so precision, it is so now, it is so cost effective, and therefore so alluring. For example, why not have all students write a written asset or a written essay and get Gen AI feedback back in a closed loop very rapidly so students can produce better work. So it is alluring, and yet we could end up washed up on the rocks if we take this approach. So let's step this out a little bit. Why do we even have a problem with feedback? And I don't need to tell you this because I know that many of you are designing education, many of you are at the coalface with learners. And you know that learners do complain that they don't get enough feedback, and that is a universal worldwide issue that we see. We know that both learners and teachers find it confronting, but both parties agree that it's very important. So even though it can be sticky, it can be tricky, it's a process that we should keep investing in because when it works very well. We also know that teachers resent that although they put lots of time into generating feedback information, learners sometimes take little notice of it, and that can be a source of frustration. We also know that teachers typically think their feedback is more useful than learners think, so all the more reason for teachers to get feedback on their feedback. And we know that comments on an assignment is not feedback. I would say that that is data. We also know that quantitative feedback in the form of numbers and grading is not feedback. It's data. So it's data that learners may or may not use to improve their learning or improve their practice. So if we go back to the definition of feedback, there are many. One of the definitions that my colleague David Bowd and I have worked on for some years is this idea that feedback is a process in which learners make sense of information about their performance and they use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. And I've given a few kind of hints about what I think is important in that definition. First of all, that it's a process that is enacted over time. Learners are at the centre, so it's about how they make sense of information and how they use it. And if you like, another way to think about this is that feedback is not feedback unless it has an effect. And if you go back to the very definition of feedback in biology, in things like homeostasis, in cybernetics, really feedback is seen as a process that involves a loop. And for some reason in education, and particularly in higher education, we've kind of perverted that definition, and we've somehow arrived at this idea that feedback is data. That if a computer gives me an input or an experienced teacher gives me an input, that is the same thing as feedback. Royce Sadler would say that is just dangling data. So we've worked with this alternative definition of feedback that is more process orientated and that is more learner centered. And we've talked about or written about feedback Mark II, where you get this sense that a learner, when they come into higher education, are orientated to the standards of work that they want to produce, but also the purpose of feedback, which might be different to what they did in high school, for example. They are then orientated to activity 1, and they do activity 1. And we ask that the learner makes a judgment about the quality of their own work. And they also ask for specific feedback on their work. What particular components would they like inputs about? Then others judge their work. And in this model, we talk about others and not teachers, because we are acknowledging that the other may be, in the context I work, may be a patient. It may be a community member. It may be a fellow peer. So we use others on purpose to embrace this idea that there are other people or other things in our environment that can make judgments about the quality of our work or performance. The learner then has this kind of very tricky task ahead of them to compare what they think about their own work and how that compares to what others or other things are telling them. And that involves judgment, and sometimes it involves dissonance. And through that process, they come up for a plan for improved work. And then the all-important activity 2, where they translate those strategies into the work itself. And at that point, we would say that we have a feedback process. If you take out activity 2, there's no feedback because there's no ability for the loop to be closed. And you can see that in all of those components, the learner has a very active part to play. Okay, so if we go back to the provocation, what I'm saying here is that, let's say the feedback input, I'm going to call it the input, might be precision-like, but it may not create any output from the learner. And we know that with, for example, teacher feedback, we know that you could craft beautiful feedback on somebody's essay, but the learner doesn't pick up the essay because it's after the point of the end of semester, for example. So there's actually no ability for the learner to pick up those comments and use it for their own learning. We also know that the source of the feedback and the relational qualities and how the learner forms credibility judgments within the feedback process matter. So again, you can have a precision feedback from a machine, precision feedback from a clinical educator in a hospital. But if I'm the learner and I don't trust the nature of those comments, or I don't trust the source that generates that input, then I'm not going to pick it up and use it. And this really kind of sits at the heart of this provocation today. So what I'd like to do is to now use the chat function. And I'll defer to Anne and see whether this would be better in the chat or within the Q&A. But I'd like you to respond to the first question. And what do you think would be better?
Let's try the chat and see how that goes.
Yeah.
Okay,
we'll do that. So in the chat function, I'd like you to respond to the first question, and that is, the arrival of Gen AI precision feedback on students' work is so very timely, given the problematic nature of status quo feedback. I showed you some of those issues in the literature, and the current resource pressures in higher education. So let's pretend you've been interviewed by a journalist for the daily newspaper. That's what they proposed to you. What's your response to that? Okay, so some really interesting things coming through here. I'm going to pick up on Roz's first comment, which is I don't think students would be very happy paying for feedback from a tool when they can get that from the tool for free. So this idea of kind of value for money, the student as consumer, I want to hear from somebody who has been around the traps, somebody who knows. And we hear that quite a bit from students. If I was a student, I'd be less invested in producing work if Gen AI was producing feedback. So something here about the relational. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about this notion of credibility judgments that Chris Watling from Canada writes about. And that is that you could have an identical piece of advice, one from let's say, a junior teacher, and the other one from a senior teacher who has been working for 30 years, who's seen multiple cases of production of work. The students are much more likely to trust and to pick up on the advice from the more experienced other, even if the content is identical. So how you perceive the source of feedback has a huge bearing on whether you pick it up and use it. And, that is not just about whether someone is experienced, but it's also about whether you relate to that person, whether you think they're credible, whether you like the way they work, whether you identify with them. All of these things will influence what Chris Watling calls source credibility. And that will motivate people to act or to not act. And I think that is really where I'm getting at with this provocation. What else we've got here? It devalues contributions by academics, but then we've got another, Jenny then says, well, actually, Gen AI can certainly help with some aspects of feedback, which might give educators more opportunity within their limited time to provide feedback on more high-stakes issues. And I think this is a really interesting concept, that idea of, and we probably use this all the time naturally. If you could get feedback on your grammar and on your sentence structure through Gen AI, you might then free up time for your teacher to talk about the line of argumentation, how you bring your, the literature, the body of literature into support or to refute your line of argument. So this idea of kind of deciding who or what would be well placed to give students feedback on certain aspects of their performance, and what would you reserve for more high stakes discussion about performance. So when there's a lot of evaluative judgment required, that's where you might defer to the human. And what I would love to see, that as part of feedback know-how for our students, that they become quite savvy about, what do I really need? What can only my teacher tell me about my work? What could my peer tell me that could be really informative about how I'm structuring my line of argument? I'm thinking about the medical education concept, what can only the patient tell me about my performance? And I'm going to give you an example. And again, it's in the medical field, but you can relate this to other disciplines. If I want to know, if I'm a physiotherapist, and I was originally, if that's my craft, and I want to know if my handling is comfortable for the patient, only the patient can tell me if my hands are comfortable on their joint or their skin. The supervisor sitting to the side could infer what my handling is like based on the patient's eyebrows, or whether they yelp or jump or provide other communication, but only the patient can tell me how they feel. And that to me is an example of, it's almost part of feedback literacy, that a learner could identify who or what in my environment can provide me with inputs about certain aspects of my performance. And I think that's come out really nicely here in the chat. Elaine has said here, the problem of lack of timely feedback is already there. We don't think AI is a great solution for it. I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I'd also, I would encourage us to challenge this idea of iteration. What if I produced a piece of work and I could get really early peer feedback or really early Gen AI feedback that then I can consider and produce the next iteration of work, and then that goes up to the teacher? Would I learn something through that process? Would the body of work or the product be better for that iteration? So I don't know what people think of that. This is a really interesting comment here. So personally, I would not wish to use Gen AI generated feedback. I like writing individual feedback to each student, and feel it's a bit disingenuous for me to tell them not to use AI to write their essays when I use AI to write their feedback for them. This is just me. So that I can see this kind of idea of authenticity and reciprocity. This again is circulating certainly at the University of Melbourne. We hear a lot about this, and I think there is a real call for declarations of when people are using Gen AI, whether that's in the production or co-production of work, but also when it comes to designing assessment and doing the evaluative judgment of assessment. So I do think we should be transparent. But there's something there as well about when I see that phrasing of, I like writing individual feedback to each student, I feel investment there. I can feel emotion in tailoring that. And I can imagine as a student how it feels when Dilhara gives me feedback and notices my work and tells me what she likes about my work and why. And that would be a very motivating force, I think, for a student. There's lots of work, and you may know the work of Rolla Rajawi, who was at Deakin and is now at UBC in Canada. Rolla's done a lot of work around the Education Alliance in supervisory relationships, but also in feedback encounters. And that idea of having a shared goal and having a kind of bidirectional trusted relationship is, it looms very large when it comes to understanding how learning takes place. So that emotional investment is something we need to hang on to. I'm just thinking, Anne, is there anything else that jumps out for you in the chat?
I think there is a really good mix of the need to provide students the individual feedback and the relationship between the feedback. And we know Gen AI is not a relational tool per se. So trying to get that personalised thing with Gen AI is one of the tensions, yes, with the grammar and spelling, and that maybe it can take some of the more prescriptive elements out of it and save us some time that way. But the personalised element of feedback, for it to be meaningful and useful, is just really important.
Agree. And I was picking up on the I know Callie here has said that feedback is highly relational. How they take on board feedback is based on their previous feedback experiences, their perception of how they believed they went in the task. So yeah, the very same message given to two different students can be taken very differently because of that context. Sadaf has talked about the idea of trying voice feedback comments. And if you've read the work of Michael Henderson, who's at Monash University, Michael did a big experiment with his other colleague, Michael, around voice-generated comments, or actually video-based feedback. And students were much more motivated by the video-based comments. There was, this kind of sense of eye contact. There was the use of, and thank you for the effort that you've put into this task. There are two things I'd like to call out for these reasons. This is what I think you could build on. If things aren't resonating, please come and see me. My email is this. So kind of encouraging that ongoing dialogue. The student work responded really well to that, but also the student experience data was really strong. They felt more heard, more seen. And, that's, if you actually looked at the transcript of the video-based feedback compared to written comments, almost identical. So it's not about content, but there's something here about the emotional that can mobilize people in positive ways, and of course negative ways as well. All right, so thank you so much. Really, really good insights there, and further things for us to think about. So the second question, and I think we've sort of covered this in a way, but the second question I had was this idea of students need to be motivated to act on feedback information in their ecosystem, the connections people feel with each other, and the trust they have in their judgments and advice are part of the feedback equation. Deleting this from the system may leave us with a whole lot of dangling data, even if it's delightfully accurate. And maybe I'm influenced by our health faculty here at the University of Melbourne, but we've got a big billboard that says precision medicine. And it's, we've got Royal Melbourne Hospital across the road, and we've got the Weehai Research Institute. We've got University of Melbourne in this precinct. And it's so alluring, this idea of precision medicine. It's tailored, nothing extraneous. It's tailored for you. And my sense is through Gen AI feedback, we could generate a whole lot of precision data that may not actually mobilize people to act. And I think we've got some evidence here in the chat that sort of people are, this concept is resonating with people. I'm just going to finish off by referring to Tam's comment here. Great comment. So the encouragement and belief a teacher has in a student, and a student knowing that a teacher has their very best interests, go much longer way towards student success and courage, which are both needed for students to be able to solve the problems of the future. AI, can it care about our students? Is it invested in their success? I can feel a commentary. Tam, you're going to have to write in a commentary in a journal. Precisely, that there is something about, and I think about the age-long practice of mentoring, that idea of there is someone who may have been through this problem or this scenario or this line of work, and they are invested in taking the time to make evaluative judgments about how I'm tracking, and may have some advice or some tips about how I could kind of continue to evolve my practice. It's very compelling, and I don't see that, even if it's accurate, I can't see that AI can generate that same kind of feeling or care that you get in that more nested mentoring-like relationship. But who knows? But who knows in 5 years' time just how clever this system is going to be, and it may not care, AI, but people may feel cared for if it continues to kind of be very responsive. So that is something for us to think about, that it really, I'll give you an example. I had a very experienced researcher. She's a scientist, and she was, we were having coffee the other day, and she said she was writing a grant over the weekend. And she said, it was funny, I just put a couple of prompts into Gen AI to get me moving. And she said, I kind of felt less lonely doing a grant on a Saturday morning because I kind of had this like sparring partner. So yes, I don't think Gen AI we know Gen AI is not thinking about this other person, but if the researcher is feeling different, if she's feeling supported, well, maybe sort of the proof is in the pudding, and maybe, so I don't know. I leave that open as a provocation. So thank you for engaging in that. So let's go with this assumption that this idea of feedback know-how, or what David Carless and David Bowd might term feedback literacy. Let's say that feedback literacy version 2.0 in the age of Gen AI involves a heightened learner understanding of their own emotions and motivation, and a heightened learner understanding of who or what can give them X information about Y aspects of their performance. So as an illustrative example, as we said before, when it comes to my grammar, I'm really happy for a machine to give me inputs. If I want someone to judge the quality of my communication skills in a board meeting, I'd really like to hear that from Anne, who's been around the traps and who's sat through board meetings. And actually, knowing that is part of feedback literacy. So we did some research across the disciplines in higher ed, looking at this idea of if you bumped into a feedback literate student, what would they look like? What would they be doing? And one of the items that fell out from the data was this idea of if you're feedback literate, you acknowledge and work with emotion. So, for example, a feedback literate learner would demonstrate volition and sensitivity in approaching suitable others to elicit suggestions and to continue dialogue with them as needed. They would also demonstrate openness to receiving comments from others without displaying defensiveness. Build trust in facilitating honest and meaningful information exchanges with others. They would recognise, and I've put this in red here, they would recognise that feedback information comes in different modes with different capabilities, or different capacities, to mobilise emotions. That might be individual and group, written or through other media, structured or informal. And then manages the emotional challenges of receiving and sifting information, which may be unwelcome or misjudged. So we did this study we published this back in 2020, and the data collection was even earlier, obviously, than that. So it was really before Gen AI had hit its straps. And already students that are kind of working with feedback to do good things for them are already exercising some of these things. And I think particularly that point in red is something that we need to develop or cultivate further now that learners are having to navigate an ecosystem with so many types of inputs. The other item that came up in this feedback literacy framework was this idea that a feedback literate person or student elicits information in order to improve learning. So I often say to our medical students, for example, you can rock back on your heels and you can wait for feedback information from an experienced other, or you can rock forward onto your toes and you can step forward to people or things in your environment in order to get the most out of that learning experience. And when you're on your toes, that's when you tend to get really good inputs that can change the way you do things. So the first point there is realizes that feedback requires active elicitation and does not wait for others to provide unsolicited information. They also use a repertoire of strategies to elicit appropriate information from others to assist learning. Considers feedback from multiple sources. So this is really big, I think, within our chat, including teachers or trainers or peers or practitioners or consumers, to provide different scope and opportunities for learning. And this is really different. Often we've just done a study with medical students' feedback literacy, and when you talk to them about multi-sourced feedback, often what they think about is triangulation, almost like that very kind of engineering view of if I have multiple sources of feedback that all land on the same point, then I can feel very confident that that information is accurate. Whereas we would say the point of getting feedback from multiple sources is that necessarily people will have different perspectives on your work. Okay, so a same level peer will be noticing different things to a practitioner, an experienced classroom teacher who's been teaching on the floor for 35 years. They will attend to different things because of where they are on that expertise continuum. So it's not about landing the same message and getting consensus. It's about providing multiple perspectives in order for someone to understand how their work, how they're tracking in their work. And I gave you the example in medical education of patient feedback and how compelling that is. If you want to understand, is my communication clear? Is my handling gentle? Is it firm enough? How do I make people feel when I'm relaying their diagnosis? Only the patient can tell you how they feel and others can infer. So that would be an example of, I think, a component of feedback literacy to really sit with that understanding. And then finally, this idea of seeks cues from the environment and the task itself that indicate the appropriateness of their work. And I'll give you an example of that. We've just done a study of feedback cultures, and we compared the feedback culture in surgery to a feedback culture in intensive care medicine. And what the surgical trainees or the learners in surgical education told us is that the tissues themselves give you feedback about how you're tracking. So if you cut a structure that's not meant to be cut and you get a big bleed, you know you're on an artery and not on a tendon, for example. If you press down and you meet resistance really quickly, you know, oh, I'm on bone here. I'm not on fatty tissue. So that was an example of the very substrate of the work. It gives you feedback all the time, and you respond to that. Just like, and they said, you know, the unique thing about being in a surgical theatre is you've got an amphitheatre with a whole lot of people in there. The patient's asleep, but you've got surgical nurses, you've got an anaesthetist, you've got a trainee surgeon, and and their cues will help to guide you about how you're tracking. If a nurse looks at his watch, you know that you might want to hurry up. If someone raises an eyebrow, if you snap at somebody, that's feedback that perhaps you should reconsider your communication approach. So they really talked about how that particular environment afforded certain types of feedback interactions. Whereas the contrast was in intensive care, often the trainee was there by themselves, particularly at night. They didn't have the luxury of having nursing staff there. They didn't have a senior that was perched on their shoulder. They had to ring the senior, who was often at home, if something went wrong. And so they said they had to kind of rely a lot more on the kind of signs and the symptoms of the patient themselves. And in intensive care medicine, that is not always an accurate depiction of how you're tracking, because you can do all the right things clinically and your patient still dies. Or you could be a little bit neglectful and your patient spontaneously recovers. So it was a very interesting, to me, an interesting and illuminating study about how the very work itself can contain feedback information, and it doesn't always need to happen in dialogue with another. Okay, so going back to our provocation, if we're saying that feedback literacy 2.0 is really embracing this idea of not only knowing how, but knowing who or what can give me information that can benefit the learning and performance. How might we then cultivate this type of rewiring of the learner? And one of the examples that I wanted to share with you is one that we've introduced here at the University of Melbourne. And it was a simulation-based intervention to improve medical students' feedback literacy. And just for, I know many of you will have been exposed to this, but this is the Carl Essenbaud definition, that feedback literacy is the understandings, capacities, and dispositions needed to make sense of information and to use it to enhance work or learning strategies. So it resonates very much with that Baud and Molloy definition from 2012. And the other thing that I wanted to tell you about this simulation-based intervention, it actually sits within a 4-year, what I would call feedback know-how program within the medical course. So in year 1, in week 1, they have a whole afternoon where we talk about feedback, assessment, and learning in medicine. And we debunk a whole lot of myths around feedback and assessment. We talk about multi-source feedback. We talk about workplace learning and the types of cues that you bump into in your ecosystem and how you can milk that for its educational worth. That's in the first week of their program. Then we've got this simulation-based activity, and I'll go through that in a moment. We've also got, when they go into placements in year 2, we've got these modules that we call learning in context primers, which really signposts for our students the types of feedback opportunities there are in specialty feedback practice areas. And I'll give you an example. When they go into their surgical placement, we would say, when you scrub up with the consultant, that is a really good time to say, Anne, I haven't taken out a gallbladder before. What I'd really like for you to watch for is how I extract this and make sure I do a clean closure at this point. And that then primes the supervisor to look for certain things. So that's an example of this idea of think about the very learning context and then how you can, where you can put and what you can do to make the most of feedback. In year 3, we have workplace-based assessments where we really mandate the learner to self-assess on the rubric. And we also build in peer assessment as well as supervisor assessment. And what we do with that is we get them to write up the kind of similarities and differences between those perspectives of self-assessment, peer assessment, and supervisor assessment. And you can imagine, based on what we've been discussing so far, sometimes there's alignment, but it really illuminates for the students that people will tune in to different aspects of performance depending on where they're coming from and how experienced they are. And then finally, in year 4, we give them a module around professional noticing. So different to everyday noticing, it's really about if you're going to be a social worker or if you're going to be a physiotherapist, how do you fine-tune your noticing in your environment and with your patients to tell you really important information? And then we do get them to do an assignment on that. So over the 4 years, we would call that a longitudinal feedback know-how program, and they really kind of feed on each other. So I'm going to talk very briefly through this simulation, just in case you feel like it could translate to your particular context. So this is what we call the productive feedback conversation simulation. They start off doing a E module. I know it sounds a bit cliche, but a bit of a primer about feedback literacy. What is this thing? We don't call it literacy, we call it know-how, so it's a bit more palatable. What is it? Why is it important? What's easy to get and what's hard to get? How does it develop over time? And we give examples of that. And then in the actual simulation itself, they go through 4 stations and they actually get feedback on their feedback at each of those stations. And then finally, they do a written reflective assignment about what they learned, but also what they were able to translate when it came to going out onto placement and seeking and using feedback in their placement environment. Now, some of you may be from health professions education, and you may know that there is a thing called the OSCE, which is the Objective Structured Clinical Examination. In that kind of setup, it's a kind of a signature pedagogy, if you like. You tend to have a scenario, and they tend to be clinical. So you might have a fatty liver, you might have a head injury, a breathing issue with motor neuron disease, etc. And then you try to kind of test people's skills around those scenarios. In this particular intervention, our learning outcomes of each station were geared around feedback literacy itself. So the first station was about providing peer feedback and negotiating that tension of being honest, but also maintaining social cohesion. And also that idea about issues of expertise and about limitations and kind of boundary management if someone has not been around the traps. So that's around peer feedback. Station 2 was about engaging in informal feedback conversations, and we really tease out this idea of a monologue and kind of listening versus what it looks like when the learner is active in a feedback dialogue, particularly around the role of self-evaluation. Station 3 was about, it was feedback in a primary care setting, and it was really talking to that idea that we discussed before, which is, what does feedback look like when it's on the run, when you've got different professional perspectives weighing in, and you've got different learning cues in the environment? What happens when the blood pressure machine beeps and someone raises an eyebrow and the patient says, please stop? What kind of feedback cues are these and how do you interpret them? And what is most important? What are you valuing in terms of that? And I will just give you a hint that even though there were all of these sources of information available to the learner in this scenario, they were still so orientated to the teacher, even though the patient was providing lots of feedback that they could have milked. And then finally, we do a role flipping exercise which is quite powerful, where the student plays the role as teacher or supervisor. And it kind of draws out this idea of the challenges in being a feedback provider, in trying to attend to the emotions of the receiver, how to bring someone into a conversation when they're rocked back on their heels, and also how to respond if the learner becomes defensive during the conversation. So it does provide the learner with much more empathy about just how hard it is to give honest and clear feedback information. So that's what it looked like. And we've actually got an ARC discovery project at the moment that's happening. And it's really looking at feedback literacy interventions, and this is one of them. And we're tracing that once learners have gone through this, what are they able to do in their placement environment, and what is still really difficult to do even though they've gone through the simulation. And we're using that kind of information to refine this particular education intervention. So that's the research that we're doing there. Okay, so some of the learnings, and this is work in progress, so it is kind of hot off the press and still emergent, but a couple of things I wanted to raise to see how they resonate with you. The first one is that one of the things I think that our learners have told us through going through the simulation is they've kind of they're learning about normalizing emotion in feedback. This idea that it doesn't matter how mealy-mouthed you want to get, or how much you want to dress it up, or whether you give it as a sugar-coated pill, that there is often emotion that is mobilized. And that's often because we want to do good in the world, we want to see ourselves in a certain way, or the community tells us that we should be a certain way. And if you get data that rubs up against that or challenges that, it can be quite confronting. And so that came up quite strongly for the learners. They, I think, got a much better understanding of this idea of inputs, feedback inputs, and their value under different circumstances. And I think that is quite relevant around this point of Gen AI. They talked a lot about opportunities for practice. So I'll give you an example of this. So they said, look, you could give us a feedback literacy model. You could show us feedback Mark 2 until every day you could flash up that on a PowerPoint slide. And we get it. It academically resonates. But we don't have the language to interrupt a busy nurse on a night shift while he or she is attending to their work. We don't have the language to say, thank you, Anne, for that feedback and for taking the time to watch me and to provide your thoughts. I still don't quite understand when you said to me I could be more considerate in my approach. What do you mean by that? Could you give me an example of what would constitute being more considerate in that example? So that to us highlighted that people need language, they need those linguistic hooks, but the students want opportunities to practice it and to get feedback on it. Practice it again, get feedback on it. And so simulation, I think, lends itself to that idea of get feedback, get feedback. I suppose the thing that we are toying with, which is very relevant to today's provocation, is what is the potential for introducing a station as part of this intervention that was dedicated to Gen AI feedback, with all of its affordances that you talked about, precision, rapid information, objective, may reduce loneliness, may reduce shame because, it's come from a machine and not from someone that you admire. So early iteration, what a great way to get feedback. but also all of those limitations. Does this thing care? Do I feel motivated when I get it? Do I trust its judgment? It's a big, large language model. Do I trust its judgment here when it's noticing certain aspects of my work? So I do think that a discrete station that exposes and manipulates some of these learning outcomes could be very valuable for our students. Okay, so this is getting down to a little bit of rolling up of our sleeves, and I'm acknowledging we've got about 15 minutes to go. So what I'd love you to think about, and some of you may have already done this, and for some of you it might be blue sky thinking. I'd like you to think about if you were committed to building students' feedback know-how, how would you go about encouraging this know-who, which involves knowing what source can provide what or which type of information about which particular aspect of work for the purposes of improvement. So some of you might just directly put out some ideas into the chat. Some of you might want to sketch something out first and then pop it into the chat. But I'd like you just to spend a couple of minutes thinking about how you might build this idea of students know how and particularly know who. Okay, so Jenny is first cap off the rank. Super response, Jenny. And I think that would be a lovely design. So you make the assessment so students are required to ask for feedback from different sources. That's a requirement. And then to produce a reflection at the end where students think about the different feedback sources, feedback they received from the sources, what was useful and what they've used and why. And Tam's got here, another reframing of the question is, how do we get students to go about their days and actively look for what they can learn from anyone they meet, as there is something to learn from everyone? Yep, indeed. And that might include you not translating the information into your learning or your work, but you might still learn from the fact that you want to deflect that you're not going to take it on board and absorb it. And then we've got from Elaine, make the assessment one where students get feedback from peers, from Gen AI and from teachers, and then a reflection looking at the gaps in each. Agreed. So that would really be about privileging perspective and what is gained, what is lost, or what is similar from each of those sources. And indeed, I know David Bowd has written for quite a lot of time about that idea of, producing task 1A or work 1A, getting some feedback, and then produce 1B that is nested, and then write some kind of appendix around, what feedback you received, what you rejected, what you took on, and why, and how you think it's benefited the work. And indeed, you could even assign, you could even assess that reflective part of the piece. And I would kind of call that, I think iteration is our friend when it comes to this idea of how we incorporate the inputs, but also this idea of the kind of metaphor of exposing the back of the quilt. So we want students to unpack or to reveal the learning. It might look neat on the front, and that's the product, but what is behind it? Where's the stitching? Where's the knots? What did you have to cut off? Why? And And through that, we get to see their thinking and their judgments about the know-who. And I know certainly in my field, in health professions education, we do use the longitudinal reflective portfolio quite a lot as students track through those placement years. And I would see that place, I'd see that as a assessment form where you could embed assets or artifacts and get students to reveal their judgments about what gave them value and perhaps what was less valuable and why, and what that means for their ongoing feedback literacy. That's a good one, novel one. So we've got Sybil saying, ask the students for feedback on the assessment task first so that teachers can better design their assessment. I like it. And then Elisa said, these types of assessments scaffold evaluative judgment and allow for teachers to then assess the emerging judgments that students are making about the value and or the limitations of different feedback sources in connection with the context. Indeed. So as I think we've discussed so far, so much potential around if we feel like we want to graduate students with feedback literacy, and we feel like more than ever in the world of Gen AI, we want students to understand the value of different inputs in their environment. We can help draw that out or kind of cultivate that through the very design of assessment. So in summary, going back to the idea of the Siren song, let's not be lured by the Siren song of precision Gen AI without thinking hard first. All right, and to send you to sleep, we've got some references there, and I'm very happy to send you the slides. You can PDF them and distribute them. And if you do have anything that drops in the shower tomorrow or as you're designing assessments, please do drop me a line. That's my email address. So I will stop sharing my screen so we can see each other.
That's great. Thanks so much, Liz. And yeah, we'll share a PDF copy of the slides. But also, we've still got a few minutes left that we could take some questions. Monty's straight in there. And I've just enabled your mic, Monty, so you should be able to unmute now.
Great, and thank you so much, Liz. This has actually been very informative and very welcome. I just had I started typing the question. It's a bloody long question, and I was going to put it in the chat, but I thought it's just easier to verbalise it. So the issue of student feedback literacy is often mainly discussed for assessments that contain text or prose. And this unfortunately excludes a number of discipline areas that have sort of mathematical or skill acquisition based natures. In many areas where there is largely one correct solution or one collective of solutions that are correct, the feedback loop so you talked about feedback loop that improves student performance is hard to visualize, particularly, you know, if students were to repeat the same math question after seeing the feedback of where they went wrong mechanically, then sort of everyone will get 100% second attempt. So instead what we do during a final exam, we ask students to face a different math question that tests the same learning outcome. So while students are unlikely to make the same mistake again, they might make a different mistake that results in exactly the same mark as before. And I think that's what students in mathematical disciplines really struggling with. Significant learning has occurred between the two attempts, but the mark did not go higher. So I guess, what are your thoughts on how we could improve feedback literacy in the more mathematical or skill demonstration based disciplines?
It's a very good question. And I suppose my initial thought is, you know, the good old make your thinking visible. So if you actually have marks or, you know, you're looking at what the answer is and the workings towards that, that your feedback is actually aimed around the working as opposed to the answer. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I would imagine, I mean, I can't speak for all mathematics professors at the university, but I would imagine they would all have some sort of rubric associated with, you know, if you get to this point, you get this many marks. So there'd be partial marks available. And, you know, I guess the feedback that is typically given to a student is a big, you know, red circle. This is the bit where you went wrong, like this. And then based on the answer, you could, you know, or, you know, you forgot about this, or, you know, the feedback is very mechanical, I guess, in nature. Yeah. So I don't know how to improve students, how they use that to improve for subsequent assessments.
Yeah, it's a great point. But I suppose if they commit their answer and their workings towards arriving at that answer, and the teacher then gives feedback on their workings, you'd hope they can lift that into the next question that is different but employing the same principles, or getting towards the same learning outcomes, and then giving them feedback on the workings itself.
Yeah, the problem we face is, of course, there's a million different ways to make a mistake in a mathematical problem. So they may have, like I said, the biggest, I see the struggle or the frustration that students face is they've actually learnt a hell of a lot from the first time they saw this type of question to when they see it again in the final exam, but their mark didn't go up because they made a different error. Yeah.
So I then go back to the good old, the good old curve where you've got time over the x-axis and you've got the complexity of task on the y-axis. And we tend to think we've always got to progress students over time to more and more complex. Sometimes it may be entirely appropriate to not push them, not get that productive struggle, and give them something that is just as simplistic in order to see the learnings translate, if that makes sense. That if you were really privileging the feedback literacy component of how they picked up and then could use it in their next problem, I would actually reduce the complexity of the task, which we hate doing as educators. We always feel so compelled to create that kind of that productive struggle. The other thing I just wanted to attend to in your question, it's a really good one. Most of the work I've done around feedback has been around kind of work that involves performance. So, the doing of things, the enacting of, hands-on kinesthetic skills or communication. And the struggle we see for learners in that and for feedback providers is that idea of even getting people to understand what good work looks like, because it is so contested. And what we end up seeing is that teachers that do this well tend to spend quite a lot of time storytelling around what good looks like. They talk about examples in practice and how their own practice has migrated over time and why it's important to do things in a certain way, what the risks or consequences for the patient could be if they don't do it. And so, if you look at the transcript in a feedback interaction, most of the time is spent around unpacking the standards of practice. Once the learner understands that, they can start to join the dots around where their practice, stacks up compared to that reference point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. We're just about at 2:15 and we were trying to keep this around this sort of length of time. Are there any other pressing questions that people have? I can't see anything in the Q&A chat, but I know this has stimulated a lot of thought around feedback practice, which is what the whole point of the provocation is.
There's two questions in the Q&A.
Oh, that didn't come up on my thing. Thanks, Monsi. Okay, from Rosalie. Are students currently overwhelmed by the quantity of feedback but under-supported in understanding how to act on it?
Such a great question. Yes, is the short answer. And we've we've had a great example. Anna Ryan is a medical educator that works with us, and she's done some beautiful work around creating a kind of feedback dashboard for students. Even for their written tasks or written exams, they get feedback on how they performed compared to their peers, and they get this at a kind of content domain level. So they get these amazing kind of feedback reports. And what Anna found out through her research is that students are just not engaging in them. They kind of didn't know what the data meant. They really needed someone to sit down and work with them around that dashboard in order for it to have meaning. So it's a bit like that kind of siren song again of like, you know, we've set up the infrastructure, we've got the data, we've got the dashboard. This is what students are asking us for. But if that meaning making is not scaffolded, then we're not getting the traction we need. So I do think we need to factor that into our assessment design, how we actually coach our students to kind of use the data that's available to them. And that involves understanding the limitations of certain data. Tam has got a question here. So do you have any comments about a culture of feedback in tertiary higher education institutions in general? If students see us model what we preach, then their acceptance of feedback may improve. So it's a really good question. We've been talking about this quite a lot, even in relation to end of subject survey results, as an example. So we say to students, give us feedback, give us feedback. It's the only mechanism we have to improve our teaching. So we do that. Then we get the data back, and then we kind of give them to teaching teams, and they write an action plan, and then something else magical happens in between. But often the students don't see the results of the feedback in action. So we have, I'm sure you do it there in Wollongong as well, but we've really tried to get people disciplined in saying, this is how I've responded to student feedback. This is how I've changed my content materials. Here's how I've changed the assessment. You know, we do respond in these ways, and that legitimizes that for everybody, feedback is an integral part of the ecosystem. The other thing that I will say, which I think is really sad when it comes to workplace-based feedback, and Dave Bowden and I are just about to release a book in September, which is called Feedback at Work, and sort of how do we maximise feedback on placement-based learning. It's across the disciplines. But what we find is that, you know, we're doing all this kind of intervention work to boost the feedback literacy of our students that go out to placement. But when they get out there, let's say they're in a primary school, they're a teacher they're a teacher, or they go out into a hospital as a medical student, they get feedback in order to kind of improve in their own craft. But the seasoned experts in their ecosystem are not getting feedback from those around them, particularly if they're senior. And so we had one medical consultant say to us, I've really tried to model this kind of feedback literacy. I ask my peers and my juniors and my patient to give me feedback, but they will not give me feedback up the chain because they think that I'm the finished article. And, you know, you could put that, I'm sure, in all sorts of other different disciplines and organisations. Unfortunately, there is a sense of, you know, achieving mastery and that you become immune to kind of seeking feedback from your peers. And if the juniors, if you plonk them into that environment and they're not seeing these practices modelled, it's a real shame. So it's something that I'm really leaning into at the moment, because it's coming out of our data that that medical students that we put through all of these interventions to improve their feedback literacy are kind of having to enact it almost as acts of bravery in the clinical workplace environment, and their teachers aren't naturally doing the same thing.
That's Fascinating. And I know Liz and I had a great conversation about conversations on Friday, because it comes back to this whole notion of how to actually not only accept the feedback, but actually articulate it or be able to do it in a meaningful way, which leads really nicely into Jenny's question about what are your thoughts on improving how students control their emotional response to feedback?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We the kind of things that we talk about in our seminar with students is the idea of kind of latency and the idea that not everything has to drop in at the point of conversation. So we hear, and I'm sure you would see this in your practice as well. Often, if you're in a formal feedback conversation with a supervisor, your job is to kind of nod and look attentive and to say, yep. And really a lot of that job is to maintain social cohesion and not to be too upset and not to be too emotive. Often then what happens is you have these side loops where you go home to your partner or you debrief with a peer on the train on the way home, and you kind of start to normalize or to validate or to make sense of what happened in that interaction. So we're doing a little bit of almost like validation of it is normal human practice to seek what you can from an initial interaction, but also utilize your network, and these side loops are part of a feedback practice. The other thing that, going back to emotion, that I think is a real shame is that our teachers are really moderating or modifying what they're saying to try to relieve the emotional burden on the learner. And I actually think it's kind of patronizing and in a way stigmatizes what it means to be a learner in a feedback cycle. So I'll give you an example. We know from our research that if I'm giving let's say I'm giving you constructive, validating feedback on what you did well today, I'll say that really crisply, and I'll give you an example of when it went well and why I think it went well. If I want to bring up a gap in your performance in order to help you improve next time, it'll take a half a page of the transcript to get that out, because I get all mealy-mouthed about what I want to say because I don't want to hurt your feelings. And in a way, what I'm saying there is, Anne, I don't think, you can take this on the chin. I think this is something that I need to kind of tiptoe around because it's shameful to talk about aspects of your practice that you need to improve. We all need to improve on our practice. And so I think if we get mealy-mouthed and we start throwing out feedback sandwiches and sugar-coated pills, we need to be really careful about the value statements we're making around kind of positive and negative feedback.
That's fabulous. Yeah, and it comes back to how we also teach people to have more difficult conversations. The expectation is you want to hear the good news, but you're not quite so prepared to hear the other side of the coin. Monty's put in the chat, sorry, I'm flipping between chats and chats and chats. Lost my screen because I'm on a different computer. I am sorry about that.
Monty's put in the chat that it's a really that's okay. It's a really good point about negative feedback in terms of it being a natural part of the process, and the importance of really, scaffolding and modelling that so that students have that opportunity. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was torn between Teams and web.
And there was something there, I think as well, about, we talked about storytelling before around kind of standards of practice and what good work looks like. But actually, I think storytelling around difficult feedback is important as well. And we've probably all had that situation where you're having a difficult feedback moment about your own practice and the room kind of drops, you know, and you go kind of cold, and there's a bit of like tingling in the fingers. It's almost like this recognition that you're not quite ready to hear it, but you know there's some truth here. And I think if we can talk about that, that's really helpful for learners to kind of to normalize it and to think about what do you do with that. You don't have to resolve it in a session. You can just feel it and observe. This is what I'm feeling. It's in my body. What might it mean? Do I need to take some time? And what we're really encouraging both our teachers and our learners to do is to revisit conversations. So if you have a difficult conversation, check back in the next day or check back in a week's time and say, and that was, we had a difficult discussion. I'm just keen to hear in the fullness of time over the week, how's that sitting with you? Because then you get a chance to kind of check that sense making.
Well, it's also too with the sense making of it is really important. But we look at the negative stuff as it's tearing me down as a person, when in actual fact, the constructive nature of it, if constructive feedback is well prepared, it's actually there to make us better. And so some of it is changing perspectives about what that difficult conversation is actually trying to achieve. The ultimate aim is to actually make you better, not to tear you down as a person.
Indeed. Yeah, and you hear those, I remember when I first started teaching out at Monash, and my boss had this terrible habit of coming in at the end of each lecture, about 10 minutes to go. She'd come in and just sit in the back row, and I think, oh God, like you sort of straighten up and you get all stiff and whatever. But she said something like, oh, Liz, you're good, but you could be really good if you thought about, so there's, it's that idea of course you've got room to move. We've all got room to move. And so that's not a feedback sandwich. It's kind of orientating, as you said, to the notion that all feedback is about learning and performance improvement. Otherwise, why would we do it?
Exactly. And I don't think we look at it enough as performance improvement. We look at it as someone's trying to attack, a personal attack, and trying to tear people down. We've gone through all the questions. I'm not sure we've had a lovely half an hour. Elise is just asking to make sure that we share, or that please share with us the reflections. We will pass back on to Liz the comments and things, and also the feedback we receive on this provocation. So we encourage you to fill out the post form. And also too, if you notice your colleagues watching the recordings or things, fill out the provocation feedback. We're still receiving feedback back to provocation 1, which is great. So people are actually responding to that, because it's really useful for the think tank moving forward, but also too for our provocateurs to know what sort of thoughts have actually come about as a result of these sessions.
Yeah, that's and just my final reflection is based on someone a comment in the chat, and it goes something like this around whether it's Gen AI or a consumer in the community or an experienced teacher, you kind of want to get everyone working to the top of their ticket. And so if we're thinking about how do I best utilize an experienced teacher within the feedback process, being quite deliberate in that. And if I can get some really interesting feedback in these domains from Gen AI and it's pointy and usable, let's iterate it and inject it into the system, so that it really does go back to that idea of design, I think, in a very Sue Bennett kind of definition of design.
That's great. So what we'll do is bring this provocation to a close. Thank you very much again, Liz, for sharing with us and spending the time with us, taking the questions, and really getting us thinking about feedback and the purpose of feedback and how we can actually change the feedback landscape while we're changing the assessment landscape as well. So thanks to Liz. Can I ask people who are still on the call to express their appreciation for Liz? And we encourage you to fill out the post-evaluation form, but we will look forward to seeing you at the next provocation. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you next time. You're getting lots of thank yous.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks so
See ya.
much,
Bye.
Liz. Thank you.